So let me maybe open up the floor now to questions from the audience. And we have microphones, yes. So I will moderate the discussion or the questions. And I have a couple requests. First, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand so that we know. Second, please identify yourself. And third, try to keep your questions short and direct so that we've got time for a number of people here. So who would like to lead off? We get a microphone over here up front.
So my name is Aaron Kelshiker. I'd just like to ask for your thoughts on the shadow banking system, especially in China. We've seen new regulation come to pass last week. Obviously, you've got asset liability mismatches, and just with the way that the perception of risk of wealth management products has been sold to the retail community there, are we seeing, what would be your thoughts with respect to similarities that we've seen from the credit crisis that we've experienced globally, and just how do you believe that the policies which have been taken to date in China would successfully address some of the concerns that I think the rest of the world is facing with respect to the shadow banking crisis in China? Thank you.
Should we take a few questions at the same time, do you think?
Sure, yeah. Sure.
So I can ignore the ones that are too difficult.
I thought you were going to use the extra time to develop the solution. Here we go. So.
Hi, my name is Lars Amstrup. This is a question for both of you. It's been suggested by articles in The Economist and recently by CNN, Fareed Zakaria, that the Scandinavian model might be a way, the social compact, the financial model might be something for the rest of the world to follow. So I'm interested in your perspective on that.
I'll take one more.
Okay.
My name is Carolyn Chan. I'm from Heidrick and Struggles. I'd like to ask you, you mentioned a little bit at the beginning about the whole what's been not happening at the board level and getting the right questioning going. And one of the things that we've done is looked at board composition around the world and noticed that the numbers for diversity are very, very low. In Singapore, 7% are women, and just really, what do you think, how could we get that going? There's a number of studies that have been done, the numbers are all out there. There seems to be this old boys club network everywhere around the world. So just curious on your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, shadow banking in China. I must say that I and many people I speak to don't have a great deal of insight into the problem because we don't understand it well enough. We know it's been taking place, and taking place in quite different ways from the shadow banking system in the US. The shadow banking system in the US is about financial institutions. It's about a whole set of financial institutions that were outside of banking regulation and the capital requirements of banking regulation. In China, it's often credit that's being extended on the part of non-financial institutions. So it's a little more complicated. I would say generally, though, that I have been impressed by the way in which financial reform is taking place in China in a very complex setting. I've been impressed by the way they've been moving step by step in a gradualist fashion, but with a very clear direction to reform interest rates, to reform the credit mechanism. But there's still a large task ahead of them, and I've no doubt that there are vested interests that are still at play. But I do have some optimism that China is going to come to grips with this problem. The Scandinavian countries, I think it's an important question. They're a very interesting model, and they're very impressive societies. Of course, you can't be, whether we're talking as Americans or Singaporeans or anyone else, you can't be a society other than who you are. So I would love to be an 800-year-old society, which is what Sweden is. I'd love to be a society where almost all the leading corporations, remarkably, had their origins between 80 and 120 years ago, which is what Sweden is. And I think it's a very interesting model of corporate management, including the continuing role of families and original stakeholders despite the passing of generations. It's a very interesting model of corporate longevity. Very interesting model. But we don't have it. We don't have companies, a whole stable of companies that became global leaders over the course of 80 to 120 years. It helps to be a society that's 800 years old. I say this not in a trivial sense. That has a tremendous sense of its own nationality, that has a language different from English, its own language. It helps. And you're seeing now some weakening, of course, of the system, precisely because of a weakening of its social homogeneity. And it's taking place even in Scandinavia. Questions being asked about benefits and transfers because it's not your own kind that's always getting it. And that's the raw fact of what's happening. The second very important point about the Scandinavian societies, and this is a point that applies more generally, is that it's a system of very substantial middle-class benefits and transfers. It's not principally about the poor. In fact, the homeless rate in Stockholm is very high. It's a system of very substantial middle-class benefits and transfers in exchange for very substantial middle-class taxes. VAT, what we call a GST in Singapore, that's extremely high. Income taxes for the median person, I'm not talking about the wealthy, for the median person, an income tax that's extraordinarily high, over 20% for just the average person on the street. So it's high taxes, and in exchange you get high benefits and transfers. Is it an ideal model? I'm really not sure. But it works well, it works reasonably well for a country that's old, has a great degree of homogeneity, and has some other competitive advantages compared to its European neighbors. So lessons can be drawn, I believe, from the Scandinavian countries, and we should keep studying all countries that are doing something right, but not wondering about whether we could put ourselves in their place. Board composition, I agree, and I don't think this will be a matter of box ticking, whether you've got enough women or minorities or people of different ages on the boards. But it's about culture. There's some benefit in diversity. For reasons that we don't fully understand, there's some benefit in having a diversity of perspectives on boards. And that's not just about industrial diversity, about people who come from outside the business and therefore are able to ask questions that are out of the box or that appear stupid. And I've got to be very careful of what I'm going to say because I'm not just talking about women asking stupid questions. But it's a difference in perspectives. It's a difference in perspectives. I think women do ask different questions on boards and are instructed by different values. And I wouldn't take that mechanically. I wouldn't take that strictly. But just have more diversity.
So let me pick up on the Sweden question a bit. And I largely agree with what you said about Sweden and how to interpret its success, or the Scandinavian countries more generally, and the extent to which we can possibly draw lessons from that. But I did want to add a couple of things. I've spent some time in Sweden. I've written several papers on Sweden with a Swedish co-author, so that's the Nordic country I know the best. And a few things that I think are not apparent on the surface when thinking about the applicability of the Swedish model, which involves a large role for the public sector through the transfer and tax systems that you talked about and more generally. And one key observation here, I think, to recognize, Sweden has a fairly efficient public sector. And when you look around the world, it's easy to find many, many examples of societies that don't have efficient public sectors, either for reasons of lack of technical competence or graft and corruption or whatever. But Singapore is another society that's always struck me, has a reasonably efficient, quite efficient public sector. And then, okay, that's helpful, but trying to map the model of Singapore or Sweden onto another society that, for whatever reason, lacks the kind of efficient, transparent public sector, that's not likely to work. So that's one reason, in addition to the ones that DPM Tharman talked about, that I think it's difficult to transport that model to another society. Second one is there are other aspects that Sweden in particular that sustains its success as a middle-class society. If you go to Sweden and you talk to Swedes and you talk to the taxi driver, his English is better than many Americans. And that's a reflection of what is by and large an educational system that is quite successful at educating a broad range of people, certainly much more successful than I think the US society is, where there's tremendous unevenness in educational quality at the primary and secondary school level. That makes it much easier to sustain a middle-class society in which most people are fairly well off than in the case of the United States, a society which has tremendous heterogeneity, not just of cultural backgrounds, where people come from historically, but even in the raw skills that they bring to the labor market. And then one last point about Sweden. It's a narrower, more economic point, but I think it's also an important aspect to understand about how it is they sustain such a large system of social transfers. And you alluded to it in your remarks that it's largely a middle-class tax and transfer system. And in particular, the benefits that come with the Swedish welfare state are often tied to employment, to operating as a productive member, tax-paying member of society, in a way that sets apart, to some extent, the Nordic countries from the Central European countries. I'll give you one anecdote along these lines.
You meant continental European?
Yes, I did. I did mean continental Europe. I'm thinking particular of, say, places like France or Spain. On my first trip to Sweden to work with my co-author, I was there for a couple weeks, so I had a little apartment. I'd walk by what looked like a health club, and people were walking in and out of the gym every day. And I asked my co-author, I said, "Well, is that a gym? Because I kind of like to work out." He said, "Yes." And so I said, "Well, can I ask him about it?" He said, "Well, it's a state-supported gym." I said, "Wow, you can go to the gym and the government pays for the gym. This really is a social welfare state." But then he told me, "Well, you can only go there if you're actually an employed person." So I, as an American, could not go there, nor could you if neither you nor your spouse or someone in your household worked. You couldn't get that. Now, just kind of it's kind of typical of part of what it is that sustains the large social welfare state in Sweden, above and beyond some of the things that DPM Tharman talked about.
Plus, I think they just to repeat my point, they do have a unique culture of corporate entrepreneurship that is worth studying carefully.
We have time for more questions. We have one up here. Let's get the microphone so we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Your last topic that you discussed was really taking a listing of what I would say is a lot of the things that you, in your role as minister, launched and put forth on behalf of the government for where we need to go. And you started talking at a generic way about this. And what I really wanted to see if I could get you to talk for a minute or two about is, how do you think we're doing? It hasn't been very long. It's only been a few weeks, actually, but there's been a lot going on in this area. I realize it's an incredibly difficult thing, and everyone you talk to, including me and others, has a very different viewpoint of what you ought to be doing. So I wondered if you could just kind of give us a sense of how do you feel about what's going on now, and where are we going to go with this?
You're talking about labor market?
Yes, the labor market primarily.
Right. Okay. Well, first, as I explained in Parliament, I don't think we're doing well enough. Productivity growth has been miserable. Part of that was cyclical. Part of that is also, it's in the nature of things that businesses don't respond immediately with new ideas and new techniques and new management methods. If you look at, since we're talking about Sweden and Germany, if you look at what they went through, in both the Swedish and German case, when they went through major reforms, it took a while before productivity really responded. It took a few years at least before productivity responded. So that's in the nature of things. Restructuring doesn't take place immediately, and even where restructuring does take place, you don't actually get significant improvements in the value added per worker or even in top line growth immediately. So it takes a while. So I think we just have to have that sense of perspective. We're in the third year of this new phase that we've taken. We've got to push ahead, and I think we will get results. We will get results, and we have the advantage of a very strong suite of government measures to support businesses. Any business that's doing anything vaguely connected with improving productivity, any form of investment, software, hardware, people, gets very significant government support. So I think we'll make it. And within this decade, we've got to transform our economy.
Got several questions.
My name is Kai, I'm a Singaporean. Talking about transfer, actually, Singapore, the government actually do a lot of transfers to the general public. I remember hearing you talk about in your budget the direct transfer to households. So you have the GST offset vouchers, you have the SC&C rebates and all these transfers. And but the problem with a lot of Singaporeans is that they don't see all this transfer, they don't see all this money. So they will keep pressurizing the government to increase healthcare benefits, childcare subsidies and all this. And from Chicago, we all know that subsidies is actually not a good word because it will induce they will loss into the system. Yeah. So my first question to you, sir, is that how do you think the government should do more to show the general public all this transfer? Yes. My second question, I think there are a few key decision makers down here. Chicago actually is thinking to whether to base in Singapore or to base in Hong Kong. So right now they are doing this. So as a Singaporean, of course, I hope Chicago to be based in Singapore. So I need your help, sir, to help to pitch to the decision maker here. Why Singapore is better? Yeah.
So on your first question, actually, frankly, all governments face this problem. What we are seeing is not unique to Singapore. Maybe Singapore is approaching a normal society. And I'm quite sure that we can do a better job of communicating social policies, but it shouldn't fundamentally be about communicating the size of benefits that you get each year. That we will do as well, and we are doing that a little better. But it's not fundamentally about what benefits you get out of a budget each year. It's about whether we are on a collective journey that you feel good about. And that's why our focus, to take the point Steve was making as well, our focus has to be on the type of work you do. In our case, it also has to be very much about education and how you give a fair chance for everyone to do well in life. And it has to be also about giving people, older people, a sense that their retirement years are not going to be worrisome years. So I'd rather focus on the qualitative dimension and focus upon a journey that everyone is on, and not just the static benefits. But communication on both has to improve, and it can't all be about what I'm getting from government.
That's an interesting perspective. I think we don't do a great job of that in the United States either. Much of the discussion is about, what am I getting out of this budget? And this broader social journey perspective, that's somewhat alien, I think, to the way many social policies are discussed in the U.S. But I see your point. So you were looking to me, I take it, to say something about, or you're the master of hard questions. So, look, I can tell you, where we are. Okay, so Booth has applied for a site or a facility at the Nepal Hill site. We've investigated sites in Hong Kong. We do, at this point, still don't know what our options are in Hong Kong. We expect to learn what those options are in the near future and hopefully be able to make a decision by June or July as to where we're going to locate our new campus. But it's this whole process of thinking about the location of our new campus, which was really precipitated by the fact that we couldn't remain in this building, has led us to think through, to some extent at least, the value to us of being in Asia and East Asia in particular. And so we've come to some conclusions in that regard, and I'll just mention two of them. Regardless of where our new campus is, I think Dean Kumar has decided we're going to have a presence in terms of facility and staff in both Singapore and Hong Kong, focused on corporate relations, alumni relations, student recruiting, and career development. And so there's going to be an increased commitment to the East Asian region coming out of this process as a result. Second, we'd like to bolster our research-related activities and collaborations in Singapore and in the region more broadly. I'm actually coming back to Singapore next month to participate in the inaugural meetings of the Asia Bureau of Finance and Economics Research, which I believe is being underwritten in its first few years of existence by the Monetary Authority of Singapore.
Yep.
So I want to let me applaud you and your colleagues for that decision. I think it was a foresighted one. So there is a desire not only in terms of the traditional teaching side of things, but also on the research side to expand our activities in this part of the world. That's kind of where we stand at the moment. But thank you for the question. We've got some folks in the back there. Let's.
Good afternoon. Paul Kitamura, graduate of the Pioneer class here of this campus. My question is regarding cooling measures, and you know it was going to come up. Sir, could you share a bit about your thinking process and the considerations that you went through as you led the dialogue and the debate and discussion and eventual policy toward the cooling measures recently here in Singapore? And did you use a reverse stress test approach to that? Thank you.
Well, basically we're leaning against the wind. We face a very unusual situation of zero or negative real interest rates in many parts of the world, including this part of the world. And there's a natural desire to look for yield. Plus, in this part of the world, a natural inclination to look to property as a key part of an investment portfolio. And that combination leads to some very pronounced cycles, and we are really in we have been in a very sharp upcycle. It's managing this is a art, not a science, because it's dealing with market psychology. Plus, also we didn't know 3 years ago what interest rates are going to be like today. You don't want to overdo it and engineer a market crash. And therefore, the best thing to do is just lean against the wind. And that's why we've had a series of measures, each calibrated, the last one the most significant, to try and stabilize the market. If it softens some, it's probably not a bad thing. If it softens prices to some degree, it's not a bad thing, but we can't engineer price movements. So it's a matter of adapting to market situations rather than setting a target and doing everything it takes to get there. And I think we will be able to cool this cycle.
There's some more questions in the back, I think.
Sorry, my name is Thomas Bridge. I've just graduated from the program. So my question is probably for both of you. You mentioned, Professor Davis, in the context of Cyprus, it was the first time, I think, that the deposit insurance scheme had actually been seriously questioned. As I personally have some assets in a different eurozone country, Ireland. They're not particularly big, but if they were big, is there any particular reason I shouldn't be looking to move them into a country who's, where I can trust that they're not going to drop the guarantee at the first request of the Germans?
So you mentioned his name first, right?
This question came up a lot when I taught last year in London about Spain in particular, because the Spanish banking system was under a lot of stress at the time. And I'll be frank, I advised my students, if you have a lot of money in Spanish banks, and I think I'd make a day trip to Germany and put some of them in a German bank. I think the prospects that the deposit insurance guarantees in the eurozone will be violated are small. But on the other hand, if most of your liquid wealth is tied up in that form, it's nonetheless a risk worth thinking about. So yeah, there are concerns. I don't see it as a likelihood that the deposit insurance guarantees will be breached in the eurozone area. But if things were bad enough, we've seen these things happen in other countries in which bank deposits are to some combination of confiscated or frozen for a long period of time when societies are undergoing extremely serious fiscal crises. So the Argentine experience comes to mind, for example, but there are others. So it's a remote risk, but if it happens, it's a very bad one, and I'm sure even many small depositors in Cyprus who are under the deposit insurance guarantee are now asking themselves, gee, my life would have been a bit more secure if I'd taken some of my bank deposits and moved them to another country before they were frozen for a period of time, and now they're in a difficult situation. So I think these are risks which individuals are probably wise to consider, at least in extreme cases. I'm not sure it's such a risk now in Ireland, but maybe in some other places.
I think the Cyprus solution was obviously mishandled, and a mistake was made. A very serious mistake was made in the first instance when they had wanted to tax even small depositors who were insured. There has to be complete clarity going forward, in my opinion. That will not happen anywhere in Europe. For insured depositors to face the risk of becoming uninsured by other instruments. If the bank fails, then you've got deposit insurance, and there's a proper method of distributing remaining assets to depositors. But that's part of the deposit insurance system. But the sanctity of the deposit insurance system is really critical. And I don't underestimate the uncertainties that it'll pose to several other European countries if there's any doubt at all about the status of insured deposits.
My name is Peter Kerger. I work for Deutsche Bank here in Singapore. And Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, I have a question regarding what you said. A lot of central banks being willing to take risk of doing whatever it takes right now, also to weaken their currencies sometimes or to stimulate the economies. Do you foresee a potential for a problem for the Singapore dollar appreciation in the face of Japan aggressively pursuing inflation? And could it be a problem like Switzerland encounters?
So I think it's a good question. We are different because our monetary policy is an exchange rate centered monetary policy. In other words, we have a target path for the exchange rate. It's not got hard boundaries, but the market has a very good understanding about where that path is for the Singapore dollar against a basket of currencies. And that means that if you see significant additional capital inflows into your currency, people know the central bank will intervene to keep the currency within the range, and usually the market does the job for us because they know what the central bank is likely to do, and they will speculate within those bounds. But it does mean that while we don't face the risk of a sharply appreciating currency in response to capital inflows, you do face the risk of the liquidity that comes into your system. That's the corollary. And this is why we need macro-prudential measures, which goes back to the earlier question. You've got to ensure that the inflow of liquidity doesn't lead to asset bubbles or a credit bubble. And you've got to have, you've got to do some unconventional things from time to time to lean against the wind and to take away that punch bowl, basically, before the cycle gets too advanced.
Do we have time for another question? Or yes, we do. Okay. I think there's somebody here in the middle. The punch bowl remark makes me think of lunch.
Hi, my name is Samir Advani. You touched a couple of times on interest rates, and I'd just like both of your views on this current regime globally of negative real interest rates. How long do you think it can feasibly persist, and to what degree is it or will it drive systemic risk at the expense of ordinary savers? Thank you.
I think it's a fundamental question on all our minds as policymakers as well as institutional investors and ordinary savers. And I'll say a couple of things there. I think the basic monetary policy setting in the most advanced economies has been basically right during the crisis and in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. Its utility or its effectiveness in spurring growth will probably diminish over time. In other words, you can't expect that by simply holding on to this policy indefinitely, somehow or other growth will come back. I think its utility will diminish over time. Importantly also, I think it's, if you're the only game in town, or you say you're the only game in town, then you become the only game in town. And fiscal adjustments and structural reforms are kicked down the road because everyone counts on the central bank to just flood the place with liquidity. So it's important to formulate careful and gradual exit strategies, not in a knee-jerk fashion, not in too rushed a fashion, but some way of gradually exiting out of an environment of low or negative real interest rates is, I think, advisable, and putting much more of the focus on structural reforms and medium-term fiscal reforms. I don't mean front-loading fiscal reforms, but clear commitment and a credible commitment to fiscal reforms. That's a far more important part of the solution.
So I largely agree with what you said. In particular, I share the central point you started out with. I think that by and large, the major central banks around the world responded appropriately to the global financial crisis. And I'm reminded, I was fortunate to be present at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday conference celebration, in which Ben Bernanke spoke and made a comment which has become quite well known. This was before the financial crisis, and one of the things that Milton Friedman was being honored for was his work with Anna Schwartz, A Monetary History of the Great Depression. And that book, very famous book, is quite critical of the behavior of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States during the Great Depression, essentially on the grounds that the central bank, the Fed, failed to take appropriate responses to the deflationary pressures that emerged in the 1930s, and that was a significant factor, therefore, that led to the severity of the Great Depression. So the fact is, the economy in much of the world, and certainly in the United States and in Europe, has not performed up to par since the global financial crisis. But we did avert the disaster that we had in the 1930s, certainly in the United States and many other countries. That by itself is something to be quite happy about, and I do think reflects the concerted effort that major central banks around the world undertook in response to the financial crisis and to the deflationary pressures that had begun to emerge at that time. Oh, I forgot to tell the Bernanke. I'm not very good at telling jokes, or telling stories for that matter, apparently. But where Bernanke said, and Milton Friedman is 90 years old, sitting in the front row, he said, "Milton, we read your book, we understood your lessons, and we promise we'll never do it again." Okay? And I think what Bernanke, this was again before the financial crisis, didn't realize he'd actually be on the job when it came time to fulfill that promise and not do it again.
Yes.
Shall we come to a close?
Yes, Jeanette, thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much, DPM Tharman, for joining us for this event, and thank you very much for your insights. We have expanded everything from international to local policies, immigration, so thank you very much. And thank you very much also to Professor Davis for your comments and for facilitating this dialogue. Do please join us, every one of us, for lunch at the Glass Lounge, and thank you all for coming to our Global Economic Outlook event. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Wonderful.